Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. Again, I am Maria McDougall, one of the college access counselors at FAME, and I use she, her pronouns. And I'm going to do a deeper dive on some of the things we've already touched on this morning related to FAFSA simplification. We're going to talk out with the old and in with the new today. And we're going to end with a Kahoot. Hopefully, most of you know Kahoot. So Nikki did polls throughout. We had some quizzes go through. You can certainly ask questions throughout, and they'll be answered in the chat, but at the end, we'll do a little knowledge check Kahoot for everyone to double check, and I threw some funny stuff in there. We're going to talk a little bit about the new vocab. So you've heard a little bit this morning, some new terms and some updated terms. So better, FAFSA, new vocabulary for all of us. Those of us that have been in financial aid for a hot minute are going to also, with you all, are learning a new vocabulary as well. I'm going to go over some of the broad changes we've already discussed, but in a little bit more detail. So things related to FSA IDs in particular. There were some great questions in the Q&A about that. We'll talk about the roles-based forms. We'll talk about contributors and parents. And I saw some questions in there and kind of dive into what exactly that means and what that looks like. Another goodbye wave to the DRT and a little bit more about the information sharing process within the FAFSA. We'll wrap it up with a little bit of updates related to asset reporting that are important, some takeaways, and then we'll end with that Kahoot. I've always made the joke that financial aid, the whole process, is really an alphabet soup. Lots of acronyms, lots of things to remember. I think basics, right? We're going to get, nobody's, we'll ask you for knowledge on this, but nobody's expecting you to remember all the terms. But some of the changes to vocabulary and terminology are going to be more relevant and visible to students and families. And some are more relevant and, displayed to financial aid offices or at the processing level. So I'm not going to focus on those in this session today. There is the Federal Student Aid Judge just put out a great electronic announcement that has a little glossary. I've got it right here. Full disclosure, if you print it, the print is really tiny, so just increase your print size. But that will give you a rundown of some of the vocab we're going to talk about here today. Some of this will be a little bit of a review, again, from some of the terms you've already heard this morning, and I'll go into detail a little bit more on these in the next slide. But expected family contribution, which, as Nikki said, a lot of us felt was confusing and didn't necessarily indicate what exactly that number is. It was often misleading, I can't be expected to pay that much, right? So I think this is a great change. And I think I read somewhere that this is kind of a return to the old term in a way. So student aid index, I think, was like the original marker of eligibility way back when FAFSA first started. So maybe it's a full circle moment, but we're moving away from EFC to student aid index. So when you see SAI throughout the presentation today, that's what I'm referring to. There are some formula changes built into that. We'll see that a little bit later in more detail with Mila. I'll touch on it here and there. Again, the IRS data retrieval tool, that persnickety little piece of the puzzle from prior FAFSAs, the name for that sort of process is the Direct Data Exchange. I think DDX is a cool acronym by and large. Student aid report. So essentially the summary of the FAFSA is going to be changed to FAFSA submission summary, which I think actually makes a little bit more sense. It's a little bit more literal to what that is. Those of you that are familiar with the simplified needs test, so there was like a pathway based on, they're answering questions about federal benefits and all of that. That's kind of, that terminology is shifting to applicant exempt from reporting assets. I'm gonna, in my head, say it as area, even though the letters are reversed, but that's how I'm gonna remember it in my head, my little mnemonic for that. We'll talk a little bit about assets towards the end of the session today. Household size is shifting to family size. I'll talk about that a little bit more. Parents are still going to be referred to as parents by and large. Like the FAFSA terminology is going to say, like, you have to invite your parents, etc. But there's also this woven in term called contributor. I'll go into more detail about that. Also, you've heard this morning consent and FTI. those are related to the direct data exchange process and getting all of that tax information into the FAFSA. So those are like the sort of big terminology changes to talk about now and start trying to change your vocabulary about now. So again, student aid index is replacing the EFC. The direct data exchange does also include increased security provision. So this whole part of this whole change is really about protecting information, protecting identities. Contributors is that new term for anyone required to provide consent and signatures on the FAFSA. Okay, I'm going to deep dive into that a little bit later. We've talked about consent. So contributors are required to provide consent for the IRS to disclose that FTI into Nikki's little waiting room she talked about, right? That module for it to then be processed and sent out to schools. Okay. Again, family size replaces household size. And this is a little bit different because this is, unlike previous years, this is primarily initially going to be pulled from the tax return. So we used to sort of say, like, ignore what's on the tax return because claiming doesn't have anything to do with dependency, which is true from an independent or dependent student perspective, but it will, because they're getting all the information from the tax return behind the scenes, it will look at dependents listed on a tax return and incorporate them into household size. This is updatable within the FAFSA. So it's not a hard and fast because we all know that there are certain circumstances where claiming is concerned, especially in divorced families where that might not be exactly accurate from the tax return. So that is an updatable field within the FAFSA, but the initial number is coming from that tax return. FAFSA submission summary, of course, replaces that student aid report. We haven't seen it yet, obviously. I think minimum it's gonna show that student aid index, possibly Pell and loan like it sort of has before, but we haven't seen much more of what that is actually going to look like when it's downloaded. And then applicant exempt from reporting assets refers to applicants receiving federal benefits and or meeting a certain income threshold. I don't see Q&A going off, so we'll just go forward. So I'm going to dive in. I want to really spend some time on the FSA ID related stuff. You know, you've heard us say for years at this point, since the FSA ID process was adopted, that it's the starting point to the FAFSA. It's the most important piece. And I think now more than ever with these changes being implemented, that is and remains true. More so than it has before, because as you've heard, an FSA ID will be required for anyone trying to access the FAFSA. So if you recall, you might have been sitting with a family or you've got just a parent and they're sitting down and they're starting it and they either don't know the student's FSA ID or the student doesn't have one yet and they can just get it. They used to be able to just get in with the student's social and the student's demographic information. That option will not exist. Okay, so an FSA ID has to be part of the puzzle. Married filing joint tax filers. So the student's parent, you know, whether it's parent, step-parent, parent, only one of the tax filers will have to have an FSA ID if it's a married joint tax return. Okay, there is no harm in both parents getting the FSA ID. In fact, I'm just sort of in the camp of everybody get one and then they've got it, right? But only one will be required to have the FSA ID to provide the consent as a contributor. When parents are married and filing separately, so they file married filing separate as their tax status, or you know they're not married, the parents like the bio parents are not married but living together, and so presumably they're filing separately. Both parents will be required to have an FSA ID in that situation. Okay, it's really sort of in that case about, and this would be, so an independent student, let's say, who's married, if they're married joint, then an FSA ID is not required of their spouse. What I want to be clear about here is I'm specifically talking about FSA ID. That doesn't mean that let's use a married joint example. Only one of them needs an FSA ID, but there will be information about both. Like you'll put in parent one and parent two, like both of the demographics will be reported, but this is talking about specifically related to who needs an FSA ID. The FSA ID will need to be matched with the Social Security Administration, which can take up to a week and sometimes can unearth problems you didn't know you had. So I had worked with a student who never needed their social before, and it turned out that the number on the card didn't match what SSA had because somebody transposed the number. It happens rarely, but sometimes there's issues. It does need to be matched before it can be used. Okay, so you cannot sit down and complete the FAFSA and start the FSA ID and complete the FAFSA in the same sitting. That is no longer an option. Someone asked this question, so I wanted to touch on it. Students and parents already have an FSA ID. So if they're returning, they've done it, or let's say they created it after one of our events this spring when we went to an FSA night or financial aid night, they're not creating another one. So once you have it, it's yours. They may have to go back in and set up two-step verification, because as you can see in the next point, multi-factor authentication, two-step verification is required. So if they set up an FSA ID a while ago, before that piece was a requirement, they'll get prompted to set up that option if they haven't already, but they're not creating a new one. It's just updates. Brand new students going through the process will create theirs, but existing people are not making a new FSA ID. As Nikki mentioned, there must be a verified email address associated with the FSA ID. So it used to be you could as long as you verified either cell phone number or email address, you could move forward with the creation process. There must be a verified email address associated with all the FSA IDs, and that's really particular to the inviting contributors piece, which we will talk about a little bit later. There will be a pathway for individuals without a Social Security number to create an FSA ID. More details are coming on that. What we do know is because they don't have information to be matched with at the Social Security Administration, their identity will get matched against the TransUnion Credit Bureau information. We will share information about that process as we get it. We've seen this slide before, but it's super important to remember that the 24-25 FAFSA is a roles-based application. So I think we want to encourage families to be existing together when they do this, right? Ideally, they're each doing their piece at the same time, which can, if they both got their FSA IDs ahead of time, in theory, a student and a parent could be sitting right next to each other on separate devices doing their own thing. We'll talk a little bit more about that with the invite process, but we think it's going to happen pretty just all in one snap. But they will only see information related to the questions being asked to them and about them. So it is a little bit siloed. They do get linked up, but it does take away some of that anxiety that I think some families feel with seeing financial information. Honestly, with the new consent process, there's not going to be much to see anyway related to financial information, but this does really compartmentalize the information for each contributing person. Contributors. We've heard this mentioned a few times. A contributor is anyone required to provide signature and consent on the FAFSA. That was from the little FAFSA glossary. The student doing the FAFSA is always a contributor, right? Because it's their application for financial aid. So regardless of who starts it, and we'll talk about that, the student is always going to be contributing to their FAFSA. For dependent students, where parent information is able to be provided, one parent is always a contributor. The other parent is if the taxes aren't filed jointly, right? So again, in a married filing separate, or bio parents live together and never married, maybe they file single, both of those parents become contributors and have to consent because their tax information doesn't exist together, right? So think about it in this scenario with these parents, is the tax information bundled, i.e. married filing joint, or is it separate, right? If it's separate, then, but they're living together in the same household, but they never got married, and they file single, both are contributors. The student's spouse also considered a contributor if the taxes are filed separately. And just a reminder on this piece, again, this doesn't mean that you're not putting demographic information about, let's say, a step parent or mom, parent one, parent two, mom, dad, whomever. The contributor piece relates specifically to providing consent and providing signature. So demographic information for the parents, if there's two in that circumstance, is going to appear on the FAFSA as well. But as far as the contributors are concerned for providing consent and, signing and completing the FAFSA relates to who needs an FSA ID, who's providing consent for taxes. Contributors are then invited to complete the FAFSA. Please complete my FAFSA by invitation only, right? Let's make it fancy, right? We're sending them an invitation. We think you're so important. Please contribute to the FAFSA. I think that we could do some clever marketing with the invitation piece, right? But let's assume the student starts the process, right? And they put in their info, and they log in with their FSA ID. They need to identify who their contributors are. We'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. And invite them. Hey, I started this thing. I need you to contribute. Here's an invitation to this FAFSA party, okay? The student must provide, as we've discussed, the parent's legal name, date of birth, and social security number. So if ever there was a pop quiz, and email address, and these, including that verified email address, must match the parent FSA ID. Otherwise, the linking piece behind the scenes isn't going to happen. We don't know what kind of communications and things are going to go out related to those processes yet, but it's imperative to kind of have the information accurate. If the parent starts the process, so let's say the parents gung-ho, they've got their FSA ID, they're logging in, they're doing the parent section, they are then inviting their student with the same parameter. So student's legal name, student's date of birth, student's social, and student's email address. And I don't know how many parents, when I have to email my kid something for school, I have to double check. I don't email them very often, right? And I have a little notes app in my, which kid's social is that? So again, the accuracy of these pieces related to the invitation piece is super important, which is another reason why getting it ahead of time can help. And when you're identifying your contributors, you're getting the information for the right person.
Maria, can I jump in real quick?
Sure.
The name, social, and date of birth have to match what's on the FSA ID, but the email address does not.
Okay. That's
so
different than what I read, but
yes. So
okay.
So a student can send the email to whatever email address, say, mom, I use my Gmail for one thing, but I use my work for other. The student can just pick whichever one. That just gets the invitation sent. It's the social, date of birth, and name that does that matching behind the scene to connect the student section with the parent section.
Got it. Thank you for the update. We've got so much information floating around about this. That's why we keep each other on track. As far as determining parents, contributors, who's who, there is a parent wizard, Harry. So there is a way to determine who will be contributing, who is considered a parent. The way that this works is that the parent wizard will ask the student a series of questions. They'll say, here's the definition of a parent. So once they go through sort of the dependency level questions of okay, we're pretty sure you need to put parent information on there. It will ask if their parents are married. So we're talking biological or adoptive parents of the student. Are they married? If they're not married, do they live together? If they're not living together, you have to pick a parent, and it will give them text to determine who that is. Different from prior years is the parent who provides the greater portion of the student's financial support is the parent who's responsible for contributing, providing consent, completing the FAFSA. This could be, I do have a scenario of a parent that the student does not necessarily live with. So I had a parent come up to me after a financial aid night last fall, or maybe it was the end of spring. She has 3 children, 1 entering college. She doesn't work. The only source of income they have is alimony and child support paid by dad. So in that case, dad's providing all of this, all of her, everything comes from that pool of money that comes from dad. So in that case, dad would be the parent providing information. That's it, even though the students aren't living there. That's a different flavor of what we might have said before, like the children are living. And even that one, we probably would have said likely to be dad because he's providing more of the financial support. But it really is about which parent provides the greater portion of the student's financial support. That parent becomes the, well, I'm going to say primary contributor, right? That parent is responsible for completing the FAFSA. So that would be who the student would invite. We do have worksheets. So new for this year on our resources and tools page, and we'll make sure to include these on the in the email, are worksheets to, related to creating the FSA ID that you'll have access to write all the information down. Especially because this hasn't, every year that the FAFSA gets filed, FSA IDs are required. So this is something that for brand new students starting the process, they're going to want to write it down to make sure they have access to it year after year, especially if they're borrowing federal loans, like it goes beyond just completing the FAFSA. And you'll notice on the front of the students section, we do have this little section for them to identify their contributors, right? So that they can have that information ready at the time they're filing the FAFSA, so they know, hey, these are the people I've got to invite to contribute to my FAFSA. Okay, so whenever possible, you can order copies of these. You can download them from our website. We want families to be writing this down because accuracy is essential for this process. It always has been, for sure, but especially with the behind the scenes pieces of needing to link two separate buckets together, it's really important to have those name, date of birth, and social demographics matching. As we've talked about, the DRT is going away. We are, dancing for joy about that. Those of you that have done FAFSAs before remember that it could be kind of persnickety. And the idea, once we see this, I'll feel sort of, I really want to run through it, but it's really just clicking that approval piece. Like the contributors were going to provide consent to have that federal tax information from the IRS put into that module through the direct data exchange and then shared with schools. Okay. The prompts for consent do appear early in the student and parent sections. So we got to see kind of a little bit of a via screenshots only, kind of a walkthrough. And it's one of the earliest things that they're going to do once they log in and verify the demographics, because it's that important. So they're going to, I have a little screenshot from what they're going to see. And it says right at the top, provide consent or be ineligible for federal student aid. It's pretty clear that consent required. So it will give them, here's, I'm providing my consent, I approve. Here's what's going to be done with it. Here's how it's going to be shared. This piece is like the third thing they're going to do. Even non-tax filers have to give consent. So their tax filing status will be sent over as part of that federal tax information. And even if the taxes haven't been filed at the time of completing the FAFSA, which would theoretically be rare, but someone's got an extension or they're a little bit late, we still want them to do that. We still want them to approve, give consent, check the box, because they're going to keep, the information is going to keep trying to get into that module until there's information to receive. The FTI, that federal tax information, will not be seen on the FAFSA by any contributors or on the FAFSA submission summary, as far as we know. So again, it's kind of, I don't even think you'll see transcript from the IRS. We haven't seen the FSS yet, but it's really just, it's all happening behind the scenes. There are going to be very, very limited scenarios for entering tax information manually. I can't really think of a scenario where I wouldn't want someone to just approve the tax information, giving consent. Very limited scenarios, they will be prompted if they fit into that category, but we just want to stress that families are providing consent. And on the good news train that we've talked about so far, most untaxed income information is removed from the formula, removed from the form. So there used to be that section that was answer all these questions about untaxed income. They're taking what they need from a tax return. The majority of the questions have been removed. Something got shifted over to assets. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But that IRS linking feature that you used to have to put the address directly from the tax return piece. And then of course we would run into families who like didn't have access to their tax return right away and couldn't, it wasn't linking and it caused delays. This kind of takes that out of the equation. We do recommend keeping your tax return with you when you do this, just to, especially for the family size pieces. Always good to just have it accessible if possible, but it's not going to be linking up via address anymore. I want to talk about assets real quick. I'm not going to dive super far into this. As I say this, remember that many families are going to fall into that applicants exempt from reporting assets category. Many of our main families are not required to report assets. A couple of updates to assets that are important for you all to know is that child support received, so for the last completed calendar year, child support received is now listed under parent asset. And also new for this year is that the exemption that existed for a business or family farm is no longer an exemption. So the current net worth of business and investment farms is required to be reported on the FAFSA if families are required to report assets. Okay. And then of course, investments including real estate, cash and savings, those pieces remain the same. That's just one of those things that's a little bit different from previous FAFSA years. Some key takeaways before we shift into Kahoot, and I want to leave plenty of time for this because I got to shift and people have to get logged on to Kahoot. Again, FSA ID early. Cannot stress that enough. Students and parents won't be able to obtain an FSA ID and complete the FAFSA in one sitting. So I'm envisioning, some of our statewide help events where a family come in like, we haven't started anything, we don't know what we're going to do. We can do the FSA ID with them at one of those sessions, but then it becomes they're doing the FAFSA on their own or they're coming back for assistance because you can't do it all in one sitting anymore. So I think all of us here, all of the work that you're doing can incorporate, hey, this is something we got to get done ahead of time. Everyone needs to consent as the student is ineligible for federal aid unless they do. And again, I didn't deep dive into this. Mila will talk about it in her session about what to do if like parents are unwilling to provide consent or different pathways for if their relationship status with parents is as complicated, right? So what if they land in one of those unique circumstances buckets? There's different pathways through the FAFSA for folks in those circumstances. The direct data exchange will make the FAFSA easier to complete, but does increase security requirements, especially to FSA IDs. So again, two-factor authentication throughout the process, the siloing of information. So, theoretically easier as long as everything's set up the way it should be. And the roles-based form will require students and parents to work together to complete the FAFSA. The invitation to contribute is really key. Accuracy, accuracy, accuracy. That's the name of the game. Okay. So if you would go to kahoot.it, I'm going to shift in a second I'm going to give folks a second to get there. So pull out your device or right on your computer. And then I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to launch the Kahoot. So just bear with me as I toggle through this piece. So I believe it's loading the Kahoot and then you should get a game ID. Okay, so your game pin is 199883. Just give folks a minute to get logged in.
These are pros, Maria.
I know.
They are on.
I know. We love a Kahoot moment. Masked Avenger. Ooh.
Oh my goodness. That's fun.
Pixel Jockey. My favorite is the nicknames are always always clever. I'm gonna give it a little bit more just to get, we've got a bunch of people on the call, so I want to make sure everyone that wants to participate gets a chance. The little animal emojis are cute too. Also, no pressure if you don't want to contribute, or if you don't want to use your real name, that's you're not totally sure. This is a no pressure situation, but I want everyone that wants to participate to have a chance to do that.
And I did not realize until this past week when I did this with Upward Bound students that you can change your accessories
Oh,
and your character. You can be a new character if you choose.
fancy. All right, I'm gonna give it just a little bit more time. Don't see any more popping in, so let's get started. Why isn't this one? Why is it not starting, Nikki? Oh, there it is. The Zoom was hiding that. Okay. My little Zoom picture was hiding the start button. All right, here we go. 3, 2, 1. What does SAI stand for?
Oh, Steve Carell.
Tried to find student aid index.
So
Awesome.
good.
Excellent. Nailed it. Student aid index. Thinking of wrong answers was hard too, because then I was like, wait, what do I put here? All right, so here's our scoreboard so far. All right, next one. True or false? The student aid report will now be known as a FAFSA submission summary. Answers coming in quick. For those of you unfamiliar with Kahoot, you get points based on both accuracy of the answer and speed with which you answer. So that is true. FAFSA submission summary. FSS. Again, alphabet soup. Great job. Let's see where our leaderboard is at. People moving up. Excellent. Next question. True or false? A parent can start the student's FAFSA using the student's demographics.
Okay, I just laughed out loud, Maria. Sorry.
Yeah, any of the Parks and Rec fans will recognize that GIF. I know sometimes maybe that is what the process feels like, but that's why it's getting simplified, right? Excellent. It's got to be FSA ID, the pathway for parent to enter the student's demographics information again to the FAFSA is going away for 24-25. Excellent. Next question. Let's check out our leaderboard. Awesome. It's content that look at the 4-point differential. Ooh, it's
Bonnie's on fire.
Yes. Okay. A dependent student's parents are married to each other but filed 2022 taxes separately. Who needs an FSA ID? You guys are right on it. Student and both parents. So the key here is that they filed their taxes separately. So in a situation where they're married to each other and they did a married joint tax return, it's the student and just one of the parents. But if the taxes were filed separately, both parents need an FSA ID, both parents become contributors. Excellent, excellent. Ooh, climbing up. Excellent. We're nearing the end. Who is always a contributor? Correct. Anyone required to provide consent for FTI on the FAFSA.
This is so awesome, you guys.
I know everyone's doing
Great.
such a great job. The repetition, I think, I know I sit with it a little bit, like every day, try to read something. So we're hoping that this multi-format presentation of the information helps it all stick in your brains, and it seems to be working. Look at the scoreboard. Awesome. All right, last question. True or false? Family, business, and or farm is a reportable asset on the 24-25 FAFSA. And I have to tell you that I showed this little gift to my toddler who's obsessed with cows right now, and she went, moo, because she loves cows at the moment. But she thinks all animals say moo, which is also pretty funny. Bingo. It is a reportable asset on the 24-25 FAFSA. That's new and different. That's going to be a change for families that are required to report assets, but you all got that square. All right, let's finish it up. Let's get the podium. Who's at the top?
Nice, Becky.
Oh, I'm loving the unicorn avatars too. Who's number one? Sarah.
All right.
Good. Excellent. But I mean, based on those numbers, everyone did just a fantastic job. So kudos to all of you. I'll leave the little dancing kitties up there. I feel like I need to close that because the music's still going.
Fabulous. Maria, can I share one thought that I know we've all talked about?
Yes.
Internally, which is, we wish federal student aid would reach out to us sometimes and say, hey, what do you guys think about this? We really do have some concerns about the term contributor being used. And, one of the things we know we're going to lean on all of you for as well is the fact that a contributor only means that they have to provide consent on the FAFSA. There's still no change, no requirement that someone contribute to actually paying for the student's education. But when we first saw that term, we became really concerned about that. And so in our materials, we'll be sure to clarify that's all parents are doing, but we know we have parents that are already super reluctant to do the FAFSA, and we hope this doesn't make it more challenging. So we'll just clarify regularly.
Yeah, it's people will say like, well, what if I set parents' information on there? They're not contributing, right? So if they're using the word contributor, that's going to be, but we'll just have to spread the word about the FAFSA definition of that word versus colloquial.
Well, are there any questions? I'm going to open up the chat just to see if anyone has a last minute question. Well, I say I'm going to. Helps if you check on chat, Mila. Let's see.
I'm assuming some came through well.
Sorry. It's not liking what I'm doing. I got it now. It moved on me. It didn't really move on me. I thought it moved on me. All right. Everyone can enter anything that they want to. We've got a couple minutes. So if you want to put a quick question in the chat, you certainly can do that.
Just reviewing some of the questions that came in during the presentation. Great questions. Everyone's really trying to dig deep. I like it.
All right, I'm going to stop recording then, so I don't forget to.